Good evening, everybody. Let's get started here. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. So we're going to call this to order here. AIA Brooklyn is dedicated to the advancement of the architectural profession through education, outreach, and mutual support. So tonight we have a fantastic panel discussion followed by a very brief general meeting. But first I just want to thank Michelle Todd and David Cunningham for helping put this together. And especially James Coster, our executive director, for everything he's been doing as well.
So you already heard a good thank you. If you didn't sign in, please do so, especially if you want those AIA credits. This evening's panel will dig into how we can clean up the construction process, make the built environment operate more cleanly, and explore how buildings can be manufactured more cleanly, and then what actually might happen to those materials and buildings after their initial program has expired. Tonight's panel is going to explore all of that, and I think they will all try to convince you that these issues are best addressed on the drawing board. So that is sort of a direct charge to this audience. I will take just a second to introduce our august panel. First to see something about technology. Just the way the Mercury Store, as glorious as it is configured. All the AV is run from that office. So after I'm done introducing the panelists, I'm going to jump up there so I can actually run the slides, and they will talk to you and tell me to advance the slides. That's just a hitch. That's just the way this place rolls. First is Lily Binder. She is policy advisor for the city's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, where she's focused on reducing carbon impact of buildings and construction. She's involved with the analysis of greenhouse gases, gas emission rates for a range of building systems and procedures. And Sylvie holds a degree in sustainable development and American studies from Columbia University. Felix Heisel is director of the Circular Construction Lab at Cornell University. He also founded the German A&E firm of 2HS, where they, this is an interesting word for me, so Felix will have to explain it. They specialize in the development of circular construction prototypology, which I assume means maybe not the thing, but the thing that leads to the thing. Felix has written and lectured extensively on incorporating clean energy, digital fabrication processes that reduce building waste. He's racked up numerous awards, and he graduated from the Berlin University of the Arts. Wei Wang co-chairs the Sustainable Practice Group at Dattner Architects, where she is also a senior associate. She co-chairs AIA New York State's Code Committee, Materials, Health, and Circularity Subcommittee. She's also National Code Liaison to AIA's Young Architects Forum, and she can also be found punishing the next generation of architects, as she is also a guest critic at Columbia University in Morrison. There will be a little bit of a Q&A after, and so I think it's time for Sylvie to, I'm going to go up there.
Sounds good. All right, maybe this is better so you can hear me. I'm a little short. I'm really happy to be here tonight. I'm Sylvie Binder, policy advisor. I joined the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice around 2 years ago. I am not an architect, so I want to make that very clear up front. You all know about the design process better than me. But what I do hope to instill upon all of you is the idea that New York City is focusing on embodied carbon now. There's been a lot of movement during the Adams administration in the clean construction, embodied carbon space, and I hope to leave my presentation with more of a full understanding of the policy context in which you are practicing. So, slide. First, I wanted to give everybody that high-level policy context. Plan YC, which is the city's strategic climate plan, strategic long-term climate plan, for the very first time, explicitly mention the carbon footprint of the construction industry. And now we have set a goal of a 50% target, 50% reduction in embodied carbon by 2033. We have since accelerated that target to 2030. I will explain a little bit more about that. But what this really does is set our broad umbrella goal and then make it actionable. So underneath that umbrella, we have an action to implement performance-based standards for low-carbon equipment and materials by this year. So stay tuned from our office for something more broad around the city this year. In addition, building off of our strategic climate plan, the mayor signed into being the Executive Order 23, otherwise known as the Clean Construction Executive Order. I've been really thrilled to implement this executive order with all of our sister agencies over the last 2 years. The really key components of this executive order is to analyze first what the city government can control within its own operations, its own capital construction portfolio, before we take standards citywide, right? We need to practice what we preach. There are 4 main components of this executive order, which relate to the architecture community. First, requiring city agencies to use low-carbon concrete in their city projects. Right now, we have 2 agencies that have released their low-carbon concrete specifications. These are publicly available. Second, to mandate environmental product declarations, or EPDs, to use electric construction equipment wherever possible, and then also mandating life cycle assessments in certain sizes of city capital projects. So really starting to get sustainability done, not just on the operational carbon side, but also on the upfront side. Slide. The other piece of key city policy that we've kind of made progress on in the last few years is the C40 Clean Construction Accelerator. If you're not familiar with C40, completely fine. They're a nonprofit coalition of multiple cities around the world. I think they're at 80 or 90 cities at this point. And what this Clean Construction Accelerator does is send the beginnings of a market signal to the market, to the private sector, that shows that New York City is serious about clean construction. There are multiple targets and commitments embedded in this Clean Construction Accelerator. Like I mentioned, it really accelerated our commitment to 50% reduction in embodied carbon citywide by 2030 as opposed to 2033. But really wants to kind of set the basis that we're interested in low carbon materials, of course, but we really want to prioritize our existing building stock. So adaptive reuse as a first option wherever possible. So really creating that hierarchy for the first time in city policy. I encourage you all to check out the Clean Construction Accelerator. This is really where we're drawing inspiration for future building code updates, energy code updates. Really encourage that. The one thing I wanted to mention on this slide, and when we do networking, I would love to talk to you all about this. A part of this accelerator is to approve one or multiple net zero pilot projects around the city. So I wanted to put an asterisk and a bit of a green mark here. This is a kind of a call to action. If you have a project that you have a client that is particularly ambitious about sustainability, you want visibility from the mayor's office, we would love to give you that visibility in return for you aspiring towards a net zero pilot project. So this could mean operational net zero and an aspiration towards net zero embodied carbon. We know it's incredibly challenging to reach that net zero from a life cycle assessment, but really showing and aspiring towards this net zero goal is something that we're looking to do in 2025. So I have my card on me, I'll have my email at the end of the presentation. If you have a client that could be interested, this is a great opportunity to elevate your work. We would love to do that. Slide. So I wanted to quickly go through the executive order. I know I don't have a ton of time. For low carbon concrete, this is probably the most concrete part of the executive order, no pun intended. Really, we're requiring all projects to amend their specifications to use low carbon concrete. And what we're kind of describing as low carbon concrete is like the National Ready Mix Concrete Association average for the Northeast region. It's very technical. I'm sure you're all also in the weeds on this. But really the best method that we have of determining what is low carbon is what is below the average. So that's something that we're all aspiring towards for city capital projects, and we know the private sector is ahead of us on this. Another thing that I wanted to mention on low carbon concrete is that we've seen a broad shift away from kind of prescriptive specifications. So if you're thinking about baking a cake, making concrete, it's not saying 2 eggs or 2 gallons of water, but it's saying this concrete needs to achieve this level of strength. It needs to be performance-based as opposed to prescriptive. This allows us for optimal flexibility in a project so we can achieve our climate goals, so it can have a global warming potential that is below this average, but really allows for construction managers and those who are experts in concrete to really accomplish that on their own. Wanted to shout out the specific agencies that have really been leading the way. The Department of Environmental Protection, probably unsurprisingly, leading the way with the first city low carbon concrete specification. The Department of Citywide Administrative Services also released theirs in the fall. And then our main city capital agency, the Department of Design and Construction, is coming out with theirs this winter. Again, wanted to highlight that this is a really low-hanging fruit. There are many studies out there that show that low-carbon concrete at the level that we're describing, at or below the Northeast regional average, does not lead to a cost premium for projects. So this is really a great way for you as architects to push forward low embodied carbon materials in your work. Concrete is used so prevalently, maybe too prevalently, but that's not my opinion. So the next piece, which is also pretty substantial, is the environmental product declaration component of this executive order. This guidance we released about a year ago, and we're really trying to accomplish a covering of all of the, yes, okay. We're really trying to cover any construction project of any size throughout the city that's using ready-mix concrete, precast concrete, or steel. Environmental product declarations, if you're not familiar, you can think of them as the nutrition label of construction materials. They give you a lot of environmental data, water usage, greenhouse gas emissions data, and requiring this at a city government level allows us that transparency so we can set goals in the future on other materials outside of concrete. So we're really excited about this. We've partnered up with a nonprofit called Building Transparency, the EC3 tool. They are the largest open source database of EPDs in the US. It's free to make an account. You can look up in your region what EPDs are available, what mixes, what materials are available for you to use at, below, or above the regional averages of the materials that you're interested in using. It's a wonderful resource, and New York City government is now contributing to this database required under this executive order. All of our mixes, all of our projects will be inputted into this database. This piece is, less so my wheelhouse, but life cycle assessment guidance came out later this, I guess in 2024. We are aligning our life cycle assessment guidance with the New York City Green Building Standards, if you're familiar with those. Those are just required for New York City agency projects. This is not a citywide requirement yet. But we're really interested in collecting life cycle assessment data and full project level information for the first time in the city. This is the first time that life cycle assessment has been required, I think, for any municipality in the US yet. Next slide. And we're really aligning our life cycle assessment guidance with existing sustainability standards. So LEED, Envision, and then for our schools, the Green Schools Guide. We're looking primarily right now at structure and enclosure. We're not looking at MEP systems. We're not looking at finishes. Trying to get to the bare bones of a building, understand what our full life cycle embodied carbon impact is, and then work from there. This comes up a lot. How do we quantify progress? How do we quantify our 50% reduction goal? We are planning to do that at the city government level via a 2-model system. So projects will need to complete a life cycle assessment pretty early in design with a baseline model. So we probably won't have actual products, actual EPDs, but you'll have averages. You'll probably have a good idea of what your baseline model is. Then kind of your final model is using 100% of the real products that you're using on your project, and you should be able to show a percent reduction in your embodied carbon using this two model system. I'll just leave this here. The one thing that I keep getting questions on this is, if you are looking at biogenic carbon, this is super complicated. If you're using some sort of material that sequesters carbon, if you're using wood, mass timber, concrete that is using carbonated CO2 and sequestering it, how do you calculate the benefit of certain materials that you use? We are optionally considering this. It's very emerging, but we are recommending that it's reported, but separately. Okay, this is a bit of a call to action, the electric construction equipment section. We can't really mandate electric construction equipment quite yet in New York City. By and large, this is a really nascent market. It's in its infancy. Next slide. We know that there's an availability issue, both new, fit out, off the line. The rental market is robust in New York. City capital agencies don't own their own equipment. We rent it. So we need to develop a sense of certainty of what is available in our New York context. Also, these pieces of equipment cost quite a bit, both upfront, over the lifetime. It costs a little less when you think about electric maintenance versus fossil fuel maintenance. But we really see those both availability and cost issues leading to some uncertainty in this industry. There is no also communication between governments, cities, states, federal government even, between us and between the private sector. We don't know what innovation is really happening. There's no understanding of where the Bobcats, the John Deeres, the Cats of the world are really heading in the next 5-10 years. So we can't accurately plan for that. Next slide. So what we did, and something that's another kind of call to action during Climate Week 2024, actually I know it's not okay to say that AIA Manhattan, we launched the Electric Construction Coalition, the North American Electric Construction Coalition. We now have 6 cities, going on 7, hoping for Portland, and about 15 private sector partners joined in on this coalition, including some architecture firms in the room today, to really send a strong market signal about our interest in electric construction coalition. And I know as architects you could probably be thinking, this doesn't fully relate to me, this is outside of my scope. I don't think it is. I think that the sustainability issue when it comes to upfront design, you need to be urging your clients to be using electric wherever they can. And there are now emerging resources that we are creating as a result of this coalition to urge private sector partners to use, to understand what is available, what is the power that they can create, and I'd be happy to circulate that to the group after today's session. But really the idea would be to have a market dialogue either in person or virtually June of this year with manufacturers, renters, the private sector, cities, and for once and for all kind of have a conversation about where is the market going, what do we need to be doing to reduce what are called A4 emissions from the construction site in New York City. There are serious air quality benefits to electric construction equipment, noise, pollution benefits. Thinking about environmental justice in our office, we're really committed to electrification, but also fair electrification. So especially in neighborhoods that are actively being gentrified, we need to think about how we make these sites as non-intrusive as possible for folks. This is just a kind of snapshot of who has signed on. We have a bunch of different cities: Montreal, Los Angeles, Boulder County, Philadelphia, City of Austin, missing one, well, New York. San Diego. San Diego is our last one. And then a bunch of different private sector partners. Like I mentioned, there is a comprehensive list of all of this electric construction equipment that's coming out in just a few weeks in February of 2025. CalStart, which is an environmental nonprofit coming out of California, has created this really wonderful interactive tool cataloging all of the electric construction equipment currently available, and they plan on updating it once every 2 months. So you can continue to refer to this tool and push your clients towards electrifying their construction sites. We are also working with the Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation to do what's called a Smart City Testbed pilot program. We're looking for pilots that are interested in using electric construction equipment. This includes the private sector. We would love to amplify any projects that are using electric equipment. the last thing I'll leave you with, and this has to do with the kind of circularity component of today's talk, a lot of what I just spoke about has to do with upfront embodied carbon, really just the design phase. But as we know, we need to shift our entire mind about this whole design process. We need to think about the end of life as well. So what we've been thinking about for the very first time at MOCEJ is construction and demolition waste. And we have Terry Matthews today, who's been a leader in this space for quite a while. But in the construction and demolition waste space, we're really exploring best practices. We're in an ideation phase. So we're looking at gold standards like EDC's circular design and construction guidelines, building on LEED, building on Envision to determine, what materials should we be diverting in New York City? What makes sense economically? Should we be making waste management plans? Who should be making those waste management plans? Should the designer be involved? Should the CM be involved, etc.? Third, should we be separating materials on site? Does it make sense to do that somewhere else that's not so urban and densified? How much should we be using salvaged and recycled material? How much can we use? And what makes sense given our sustainability goals? We know that we have an issue with government efficiency, so we need to make sure that we digitize all of our waste, our weight data, our volume data, so we can better understand and track, so we can reduce our emissions. And lastly, we're thinking about how do we tie these best practices to real outcomes. So how can we make sustainability tied to payment, for example? Okay, I think that might be it for me. There's my email. I have my cards here. Thank you so much.
Give it all right. Don't worry, I have my 5 slides. Hey everyone, so I've been introduced, so I'm from Dagner. So we are a tried and true New York City firm. Most of our projects in New York City, and we live in our projects, we feel our projects. And so I won't go into the projects, but I do want to say, and maybe a lot of you can resonate, is that being sustainable is a messy process, and our beliefs, our understanding and values evolve. I can remember when I just joined Dagner 8.5 years ago, our understanding of sustainability was very limited. I literally think like, oh, I will just pick some material that is better for the environment. But my understanding for sustainability and circular economy has evolved and changed over the years. So I want to take the opportunity today just talk a little bit about circular economy, but and then dive in a little bit about EDC circular design guidelines. So thank you, Sylvia, for teeing up for me. But before we get into next slide, please. Before we get into the EDC guideline, maybe this is really obvious for this audience, but I just want to talk a little bit about what is circular economy on the larger context that is beyond our industry. So I love this diagram. You probably recognize this. This is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's butterfly diagram. So on your left-hand side, you have the biological cycle. So essentially it has to do with material that we consume. And so at the end of its life, it can safely go back to Earth. So the center concept for the biological sphere is really about regeneration, right? So it's not about lessen the environment impact, but it's about how do we build nature capital and how do we actively make it better. So on the right-hand side is the technical sphere, so usually involve material that we use. So, our metal, plastic, man-made material. But these two spheres do intersect. So you talk about materials like wood at the end of its life, it's so degraded that it eventually finds its way back to the biological side. So you can see on the technical side, the inner circle are surrounded by the larger circle. So what does that mean? Sometimes we talk about circular economy. Oh, you recycle the material, therefore it's circular. But it's really on the outer edges, way less impactful. What's more effective is if you can just maintain the existing structured product, or you could reuse it. So the idea is that you retain the highest value of the material, but without just recycling in a linear path. Is you take it apart and then you just, down to its material versus like keep it as a system. So the idea of architects, we think about buildings not as products, but really as a series of different systems, how they interact with each other, and how we think about how we coordinate with all different trades. So that's what we were talking about, like the idea of mindset and how we think linearly versus circular. So in a nutshell, linear is make, waste. So you extract the material, you produce it, you turn it into product, and then you discard it, and then eventually find its way to the landfill. So the math just doesn't check out. Like, you're gonna use up things. So, and then also we're literally throwing away valuable material that can be used, like financially incentive. So I personally feel like sustainability and economic, doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. So now that we set that up, let's talk a little bit about the circular design guideline and construction. EDC circular design and construction guideline, I'm just gonna call it CG. So last year it was super exciting. Earlier that year, like some of us were like, oh my God, it's gonna drop, it's dropping. And the guideline came out. So this is the first comprehensive, I would say in New York City, while it's not official policy, but it's the first comprehensive guidelines that we can implement circularity and strategies for circular practice. So why is this so exciting? Because EDC actually has a large portfolio on capital project. They have about $9 billion across. They are New York City's developer. So the goal is to utilize the guidelines, but not only in a way that the things that we talked about, reduce carbon, reduce pollution and waste, but it's also about building up the demand, because when you have a large enough project, suddenly you require, I need a tradesperson to specialize in deconstruction versus demolition. You also build up knowledge across the sectors, so architects, engineers, and contractors are learning as we go through the process. So super exciting opportunity for Dagner that we won the RFP for Spark, and you may have heard the project in Kips Bay with AIA. So this is going to be the first pilot project to test out the circular design and construction guideline. So we have limited time, so I'll just give you like super highlights, but just go on their website and download it. It's like 35 pages. You can read it, on your commute. So 3 things I want to use, like they're not tools, but just maybe components. So the first one is circularity audit. So what that is that is a little different from your traditional project workflow. Is if you deal with an existing building, a lot of times we're just going to demolish it. It's cheaper to build new. But with circularity audit is that you want to have an understanding of your inventory of what's on your hand. As a building owner, you want to know what actual values you have with the property that you own, right? So you want to kind of do a circularity audit by assessing how much do you have on hand and what is the quality and condition of the building components. So that is huge for the way we practice, the way that we analyze data, the way that we capture what do I have already and how can I incorporate that. Without knowing that, you can't really assess how do you design for your new construction to incorporate the inventory that you already have in hand. So, I guess you can go to the second slide. The slides doesn't really match with the talking points. Just a backdrop. So the second part is circular design construction plan. So that will be the primary deliverable for EDC, because with EDC projects you have to have deliverables, so you prove what you've done. So CDCP provides a framework. So what do I have to provide to EDC to show that we are doing the things that we're supposed to be doing? So circularity audit is definitely one of the components that's in there, but also engage all stakeholders of a project and talk about your vision starting from the very beginning of the project. So that actually touch up on when do you engage your CM, right? Typically you maybe do it toward the end of CD, maybe you're ambitious ED. But with a circular project, you really want to get them on as soon as possible. I just had a conversation with my colleague who's on Spark, and so it's, it's not early enough. It needs to get them even earlier. And the third piece is the material tracker. So that's more of a sort of a live document that you incorporate all your circularity audit and, life cycle analysis for the building product. What you have now, and then also in very early stage, through the massing, you do a sort of high level LCA and just kind of see, okay, this is the stuff I have, this is what I'd like to achieve, and then how do we kind of merge all this together and then set your benchmark and then set your goals. So all of these three things, except for circularity audit, you will do through concept to maybe SD, but all the other document, your circular design construction plan and your tracker is going to be, it's an iterative process. You will continue all the way through your procurement process, maybe even into CA. So with the time that I have, I want to just talk a little bit, maybe next slide. It's really small, I'll just talk about it. It's about the phases of how do you, so what do you have to do? So a couple highlights I mentioned earlier. In concept, you really want to get your stakeholders, including your CM, hopefully, to talk about, okay, what's the vision, right? Before getting into circularity, assess what you have, because it's very project specific, especially when you deal with the existing building. And then when you get into SD, if you haven't started the circularity audit, right, you want to start that. And then this is really for you to have an understanding of what is the project specific goal. So setting that goal, and that goal is going to shift, right, because we're kind of seeing the Spark. It's really not, it's messy, right? So once you have the audit, you start to think, okay, I can't use all of the material in my new construction. So what's the plan? You want to make sure your goal is to reuse them, but if you can't use it yourself, then you have to see what's the third party, like, so there's going to be an outreach process. And so who's out there, right? So this is the kind of expanding, building up the demand in the city, which is super exciting. We've heard companies like Doors and Hinged, it's like a super cool, interesting niche market. But how do we scale it up? It's not going to be like Facebook market style. It's going to be systematic. Like, what's the storage logistics situation? How do we, in New York City, our real estate is so valuable. Like, you talk to folks in San Antonio, they have their deconstruction mandate policy for buildings at a certain time period. But it's Texas. They have ton of spaces. Like, for us, it's like our land worth more than, right? So what is the logistics and how do you maneuver these materials in the city? In my head, I think like, oh, policy needs to be incentivized, and there is an infrastructure portion and there's also a technology portion. Like companies like Ripley can they assist for this sort of logistic complicated problem. So then later on in phase, I think EDC called preliminary and final design, is really kind of hone in on keep editing your CDCP as you develop your program, because once your CM come on the project and they're going to tell you this is ridiculous, this is impossible, or this is doable, this is low-hanging fruit, this is maybe in 10 years. So just gauge, like, are we just like pie in the sky, or we're close? So architects need to have that kind of feedback and to understand the current market, but also how can we push the market so that it can facilitate the circular practice. So just kind of summarize this. I think it's really exciting for EDC, and projects like Spark are piloting the circular design and construction guideline, and hopefully. And it's exciting to see, like, LCA project for a certain government agency project. I think the goal is, through all these pilot programs, we can expand beyond capital projects or city agency project. And then once the infrastructure is built up, there's hopefully policy in place that incentivize some of the practices and to break some of the barriers that we can expand beyond and really kind of implement the circularity. So I see right now is a growing pain, and it's gonna get it's gonna get harder before it gets a little bit easier. So check it out. I love that document, and we can't wait to talk about Spark Energy next year. All right.
Thanks so much for inviting me to speak here today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, so I'll try and go through these slides really quickly so that we can engage in this conversation. Next slide. James, you asked what is a prototypology. I brought two just in a means to kind of introduce myself to you. This is a building that we built in 2019, which is made out of 99% salvage materials, secondary materials. So the question is, how far can we push the envelope in our office projects? We're very, very happy to be able to have plans that allow for that. Next slide. And then this is a project where we designed for disassembly and can sort of confidently say that 99% of the materials that are in this building can go back at a high value and high utility into their original material cycles. But next slide. What I wanted to talk about is our research that we're doing at Cornell University at the Circular Construction Lab, which is a lab that sort of focuses on two main aspects. On the one hand side, what do we do with all the materials that are in buildings already today, and how can we activate those for future buildings? And the other, how do we now design differently so that the buildings that we build today don't run into the same issues that we just addressed in the existing buildings? Next slide. Thank you, Sophie, for setting this up. I wanted to add one more sort of thought about why circular construction is important. We, as an industry globally, are taking up more than 50% of all the materials that we take out of the Earth's crust. We're producing roughly more than 40% of all the solid waste, and we're responsible for 40% of the carbon emissions. That's from the beginning to the end of buildings globally. Next slide. And the important thing that we need to sort of keep at the back of the mind every day when we work is that the timeline that we have to fix that is extremely short. So Architecture 2030 published this slide a couple of years ago when we still had more time, where the assumption was that if we don't get emissions reduced by 65% in 2030, we're not going to hit the Paris Climate Agreement to reduce emissions or to reduce global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to post-industrial times. We all know how our industry works, how long life cycles are, or design cycles, or construction cycles in our industry. So every building that's being built right now counts into that 2030 already, essentially. Right? And so every design thought counts to this goal. Next slide. And so what we're trying to establish is kind of a shift in the system. This is a different way of representing the butterfly diagram, kind of trying to cut out the loose ends, going away from landfill, going away from demolition towards a system that is circular, and the closer and the smaller the circle, the better. So reuse is much better than recycling, for example, even though they're both strategies in the circular economy, but reuse is local, is minimal remanufacture, it's minimal emissions, etc. But recycling is still a global system that ships steel around the world, so there are very, very big differences between reuse and recycling. Next slide. How can we address that? There's of course two aspects to this. There's the selection of materials, and I think we all know this pyramid about sort of the embodied emissions that are associated with materials. But then on the right side, because I'm going to talk quite a bit about deconstruction next, I want to make sure to kind of place deconstruction as a strategy in this hierarchy. The best is always probably to not build. And then after that, there is building maintenance, preservation, there is strategies of adaptive reuse, and then the further down you get, there you find deconstruction, and it's sort of the last resort for anything that we shouldn't do. We shouldn't demolish and we shouldn't landfill, because deconstruction is a way to sort of bring at least some materials back into the cycle. So it's the sustainable alternative to demolition, and that's how we have to understand it. Next slide. So we wanted to understand what deconstruction is and did our own project because we wanted to kind of hands-on experience to learn what are we actually talking about. This is a project that we did in Ithaca, New York. What you see is a demolition of a whole street to make space for 300 new student housing units. And we convinced the developer, instead of demolishing 11 houses, he demolishes 10 and we deconstruct one side by side as a comparison. Next slide. And so we carefully carved this building into pieces. It's called a panelized deconstruction. If you do that, sort of a kind of mixture of the careful unbuilding and a mechanized system. And so these pieces go on a flatbed truck, get shipped offsite as quickly as possible to then be post-processed and disassembled in a warehouse under controlled conditions. Next slide. And so after 4.5 days, we had this 13-bedroom residential building down to the ground, and all the panels were stored at a local reuse center for post-processing. Next slide. And the interesting thing and the sort of important thing for us in the study was to put away with two kind of major misconceptions maybe of deconstruction. One being it's more expensive and one being it lasts longer, it takes more time. Generally that's true, but we have tools to overcome that and we can communicate that to our clients. In this case, we spent 4.5 days instead of 2 compared demolition to deconstruction. That's acceptable, I think, on every site when we're clearing the site to move towards a new project. And we were able to offset the additional labor cost through the resale of the materials that we salvaged. And so in the end, we were cost competitive and time competitive with the demolition project that were happening side by side. Next slide. But what we also use this project since for is kind of the understanding of what do we do with the materials, how do we process those materials, and what are the kind of major barriers to deconstruction. One was just mentioned, how do we even understand what is in a building, how do we run an audit. And so we're working on a software tool that we call Scanner, which uses your kind of phone slider scanner. So no $30,000 equipment, but something that we all sort of have in our pockets to do quick scans and then run algorithms through these point clouds to get a quick estimate of what are the materials in these buildings, just to have a more informed conversation with your permitting office, with your contractor, with your building owner about the potential of deconstruction in this project. Next slide. We're also using the data that we're collecting to build a digital twin of Ithaca. Ithaca is an interesting case study because it's the most progressive city in terms of policies in the state. Ithaca signed a Green New Deal in 2019 that promises to electrify all buildings in the city by 2030. That is incredibly soon. I'm not sure if we're going to get there, but the ambitions are there, and the ambitions drive incredible research and development right now. And so this tool helps in the conversation with the city. How do we actually understand decarbonization and electrification holistically? Because of course we can swap out equipment, but what is the, for example, the embodied carbon impact of the added insulation? How can we offset equipment in embodied carbon measures? So what is the holistic aspect of this project? And so this is where a tool where we can run sort of scenario simulations over all buildings in the city. Next slide. More and more we realize that we have quite a few very successful case studies, projects, examples out there. I think we've proven that circular construction is possible, it's feasible. The question is, how do we scale it? We've heard this question before today. And much of it has to do with policy and code. And so We've just published a white paper with 19 policy recommendations for the state of New York. You can download this for free on our website. Next slide. But to kind of give you the highlights, part of this white paper was in kind of a question of what's the impact of a shift to deconstruction and building material use for the state. And the estimate is that there's a $3 billion economic potential in this shift. There are 12,600 new jobs in this shift. So there is an economic argument to deconstruction as much as there is an environmental argument to deconstruction. Next slide. And then these are the 19 recommendations. There's sort of sorted in 5 main chapters about building the workforce, building the market, building the infrastructure. We've heard a lot about the need for that. The potential of the state to lead by example, similar to the EDC in New York. The state has an incredible portfolio that they can utilize to run example projects. And then questions of long-term circularity and support for that. Much of it has to do with data management, data gathering, visualization, similar things we've heard already today. Next slide. The other aspect that I mentioned in the very beginning is how do we now design differently? And so this is a little small structure on the art squad of Cornell University, but it's built out of the materials that we gathered from this project. So it's all salvage timber. And interestingly, even though it's so small, it's big enough to trigger a full building permit process in the city of Ithaca. And so we had to go through the process of how do we get a building permission for a structure that is built out of salvage timber where the timber is used structurally, which isn't in the code. And so that triggered a lot of questions for us that we now went through on a research, from a research perspective. Next slide. You recognize yourself. So one question, of course, is how do we process these materials? How can we value these materials aesthetically? What is the difference between a 120-year-old timber and manual patterns and tool marks? Many of the qualities that you see right now in this building today. Next slide. But then the other question is how do you join materials that have a larger tolerance, for example? With salvage timber comes, in this case, we had a tolerance of sometimes up to ½ an inch. Hard to accept in today's construction industry, right? So how do you develop details that can work around these kind of intolerances? And how do you track materials? How do you know where this initially came from in the donor building? Where is it now? And where does it go in the future? And how does the continuation and the connection between the physical object and the digital database actually keep intact, which is something that I don't know yet how to do. Quite honestly, we've tried in many different ways. There are many different technologies out there, but so this is a question I think for all of us to figure out in the future. Next slide. But then coming back to kind of the structural permitting, the design values, the structural engineering, we've tried to identify what are the main design values that we need when moving to structural reuse, and figured out that we were working on this with Schleichberger and partner, and the interesting thing is that the design values for timber all go back to the species. So you look up the species in your textbook, you know the design values, you go and do the structural engineering work. If you don't know the species, which is often the case in a deconstruction project, those don't really help you. So we thought, oh well, it's easy, we'll just ask an expert what's the species. We send out samples to 3 different nationally known experts who got 3 different answers. So what do we do now, right? So we ran a lot of calculations, we tested the material, we had destructive testing, we did acoustic testing to get kind of values out of this, and in the end figured out the density is a pretty good indicator of the strength of the material. So that's sort of lesson one from that. Next slide. The next question was, can we actually reuse fasteners? Can we reuse holes? Like what happens if I take a screw out, put it back in, if I just move a building? There's no structural code for that. How do you calculate that? So we did a lot of tests on that. We put screws in, took them out, put them back in, tested it. What's the difference in terms of structural strength? Turns out, again, you can reuse fasteners as long as the density of the timber is high enough. It all goes back to the quality of it. Next slide. And so now we're working on a project, and we just had a fantastic meeting today with some of you that are in the room here today about the question, can we do engineered timber from salvaged materials? So kind of not only reusing the material directly as it is, but going towards kind of larger spans, things like that. But what can we do to reduce the impact of that? And the glue and the adhesives have a large role to play in massive timber construction today. So we're trying to figure out a way, can we do engineered timber products without adhesives? So just circular construction. Right? And so that's something that we just got a grant for from NYSERDA, and we're really excited to show some results hopefully in the future. Next slide. And then just as a last note, on the design side, what we noticed in our own projects is that circularity assessments come too late. Because actually the feedback that you get from circularity assessments can lead to much better design decisions. But even in our sort of prototypologies, we designed the building, and in the end, we did an assessment so that we can store that data in a material passport so that then future generations can reuse that material. But if we would have done that assessment earlier, I think the building would look different, right? Maybe even more circular. And so what we developed then in the lab is for teaching purposes, but maybe the offices have use for this as well, is a plugin for Rhino Grasshopper, which is called Rhino Circular. It's on Food for Rhino. Anyone is interested to try out. It essentially builds a material passport and a circularity assessment for you at any moment in the design phase. It shows it directly in the drawing space. You can of course turn it off, but it's sort of omnipresent every time you make a change in your model. Numbers update. So there's an immediate feedback if you want it, just as another tool that maybe is helpful in these processes. Next slide. And I think the last one is just a shameless plug. If you want some more information, we also write about it. And with that, thank you.
Who's got a question? Go, John.
Sure. Sylvie, in terms of the implementation of these, you mentioned to, for instance, have concrete, the special concrete. Is that being incorporated? Is it intended to be incorporated in the code? Is it in the energy code? Is it in the construction code? How does the city intend to have that become real?
It's a great question. So right now, all of the policy is just at the specification level. We haven't yet brought this sort of lessons learned citywide. It would be embedded in the building code. You know, our implementation of performance-based standards would be in the building code. So performance-based, you know, you can probably draw from A to B. If we're thinking about environmental impact, right now we're thinking about carbon emissions, global warming. It would need to be global warming potential. That's what's on an EPD for concrete. You would have global warming potential requirements for concrete in the building code. We're not there yet. We're talking to the Department of Buildings. They're a willing partner. I encourage all of you to explore performance-based specifications so that the architecture community is behind a proposal like this. when and if this is introduced this year, as is our goal, there's definitely a fire under my feet as a policy advisor to pitch that to the Department of Buildings. And yeah, we're in discussions. It'll be building code.
And just a follow-up, are there many concrete companies out there that can provide?
Yeah, we've done a lot of market outreach. There are the big guys and then there are the kind of mom and pop shops. The National Ready Mix Concrete Association, which is like the largest trade association, is fully behind a proposal that sets global warming potential limits, especially if it starts fairly reasonable. Like New York State just came out with global warming potential limits for their capital projects on the state level. We now have, started to implement those things on a city capital level. There's absolutely market availability in such a robust urban center like New York. You don't need to innovate extensively to get to the limits that we're talking about or that we would think about to set global warming potential limits at the beginning. That sort of innovation is happening though. I think you mentioned urban mining as one of your partners. Using ground glass, so we can use post-consumer glass in concrete instead of cement. Using hemp, using really innovative materials. That's all happening at the like NYSERDA innovation grant level, but to achieve a global warming potential value that we're thinking of, which is like average or slightly below the average, it shouldn't require anything innovative.
That's good to hear. So I've got one for Wei. So for all of us who've run firms or are involved in the leadership of architecture firms, our costs are all labor primarily, right? So and the research to innovate also has a cost. And sometimes that's driven, if we're lucky, by a desire on the part of the client to do something innovative. Sometimes it's not, we have to lead them. And so I guess I have two questions. Sort of, how do you lead a client in that direction if it isn't automatic or already in their wheelhouse or set of desires? And then as a firm manager, how do you manage this sort of additional, feels like an additional piece, like it's sort of research oriented, right? This idea of we're going to have salvage materials, we're going to have greener materials, or we're going to have low carbon concrete. How do you manage the sort of tracking and all of that within standard architectural fee structure?
That's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
You wait for the perfect client. No, you don't. So what you do is it really depends. I think the way to start a conversation is not so much like rely on do the right thing. No one's gonna do it because I just recently in my own space when I see the sticker price, I was like, oh, let's go for that one. But it's really about what is the overall matrix that you're looking at. So when you look at a building, it's not just the additional capital cost, it's the operational cost that we think about. It's how easy it is to maintain. Also, there are a ton of things that the low-hanging fruit that you can get for your client without them even really realizing there's really a difference. So, for example, when you talk about, higher performing concrete, there are actually a ton of manufacturers out there. There's so many different options already that you can use these like greener concrete without even seeing the price difference. Sometimes we're like, just put them in specs, they won't even know. Because it's really about your structural, your concrete strength, right? If it meets all the performance criteria that we talked about, what difference does it make for them? And another thing is, Sylvia and I earlier were talking about when you approach a client, don't talk to them about LEED, all these certification. Who cares? It's just a tool. But the way that you sell it to them is, what do you get? What's your marketability? What's the indoor air quality is like? How do you enhance your user's experience? Like, I feel like as architects, really kind of see it through their lens of what their struggles are. And sometimes I wish that I know more about what their why and why not, and then to figure out to kind of tackle through that. But it's an uphill battle. I think it is, you kind of rely on not just like the grassroots, let's do the right thing, let's fight for it. But it's all the components that kind of come together, policy, tools, all these things. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Sure, yeah. Sure. Sarah?
Yeah, I think those great questions with great perspective, James, of putting it in terms of labor. I would like, I'm starting projects all the time with clients, and I would love to be able to tell them, well, if you choose this, you invest in this, think of it as investment for your health, for your safety, for other things, especially, I mean, health alone. If people realize that they're in a polluted environment, I'm wondering, I would like to have a set of tools myself to begin that conversation that says, what if we chose this material instead? What if we did it this way instead of that? Is there anything, we've got thousands of pages written, is there anything that's in a comprehensive, easy to access form to begin a project? Toolkit?
That is the atlas that we all need.
Yes, okay.
Actually, we were in our code, in New York chapter, we're talking about that as a group, like, what is the thing? How can we just have immediate access to them, talk about how often you update the data, and then we quickly see, like, oh my God, we don't have time. But how, where is that? I mean, there are companies like Mindful Materials, right? You can kind of use their database and their.
Well, I don't know that. I think, I mean, internal knowledge, I think you guys have this as part of your daily experience and your daily endeavor. I'd like to make it mine. How do I do that? You know, where do I access this? Where do I, that's the.
Let's talk about that.
Okay.
Maybe we could, like I learned about Felix's tool, the circular, right? And
We
then
can
there's-
post that on our website. We can make it accessible. We can create a place for this kind of thing to go. I don't know, I'm just thinking about everybody, but.
No, definitely. I think sometimes it's about like the aggregate knowledge, but how do we just kind of tap into that and then have that form that we can all access? I mean, that's a great question. I don't know logistically, how do you manage that? And also, is this like official, or this is just like open forum knowledge, is this like Reddit for architects?
Well, TikTok is going down. We could start a new thing, so, yeah.
No, but that's a good point. Like, I think having that kind of atlas that is built by the community, right? Like you tap in, I think, crowd and reclaim this group that's formed in your city and just kind of get all sectors come together. I think anecdotally through these groups, and we kind of tap into these like groups, but what is the centralized knowledge and how do we build that support system? Maybe it's not that one centralized, but it's like the network that you can tap into, and then once you're in it, then someone can guide you. Oh, I'm looking for that. Like, oh, I know a group that you can kind of get into the conversation. So,
I was just gonna add really quickly, I think it's worth a whole other session on databases. Like I spoke a little bit about the EC3 database. It's a collection of EDs. The concept of open source data is, democratizing the data that is, right now really siphoned off to sustainability professionals, to policy professionals. But the fact that this database is free to use, open source, you can kind of filter what EPDs are in the New York metro region. What is even the range of possibilities for concrete of a certain strength in my area? It's revolutionary in a way. It's not centralized, it doesn't qualify, this is the best material, but at least you have a sense of what's available to you. And then of course, if you're bidding on government projects, there are databases that kind of overlay and try to say, okay, well, this is a material that complies with New York State by clean requirements, for example. There's a platform called Built to Cold. So those are two I would recommend people check out. The EC3 database and Built to Cold, especially if you're bidding for government projects. But I agree with you. I think there's definitely a lot more work to be done to make things more accessible and equitable.
How do you feel about doing a lunchtime webinar on a random Thursday about that?
Happy to.
You all heard it. Felix, I think you had something to add.
Yeah, as a representative of academia, I'd be remiss to not mention right now that there's a bunch of graduates coming out every year that we try to train in these tools. I think they've maybe, because they're so fast evolving, I think academia plays a role in keeping up with these tools and kind of passing that information along. So that I hope that the next generation, which is part of the office infrastructure, is another possible source for these databases.
We convinced Felix to come all the way here from Cornell, so I definitely want someone to lob another question at him. While you're thinking about it, maybe on the way out or something, just note the stanchions that are around this space that are holding up the glass. They're old timber. You can tell from the top section. Some of them even have the penetration of old screws from 100 years ago when the building was constructed. So even some of the material in this very contemporary modern space is actually harvested. So that's kind of cool and kind of just a little micro version of the kind of stuff that Felix was showing us in the slides. Go.
Hi, Walter, urban designer with
Ciao.
Middle Office Landscape. We, for the past decade, have been working on New York City's first net zero neighborhood. It's in the Rockaways. It's called Arbor East. It's a public-private partnership with HPD and L&M Development. And I got excited about your construction electric equipment. I've been doing the dance with FDNY on this, and they're a key partner because to charge the big backhoes and front-end loaders, you need a battery to charge the battery. And to get that battery on site, FDNY has issues with that. So that's going to be a key partner to unlock. Just a thought, and then the question. The question is, within this project that's now under construction, parts are being occupied, there are a series of nonprofit farms. One is run by Campaign Against Hunger, Dr. Melvin Samuels. And in the design of that farm, our firm set it up for a mini electric articulating loader. Now that the farm's operational, they're starting to pursue funding for that. Do you know any funding sources? It's a mini one, it'd be about $60,000 budget for this nonprofit farm.
Yeah, I do have ideas. The first thing is FDNY is such a critical partner in so many pieces of this puzzle. Even just, somebody may be aware, DC had a mass timber studio last year. FDNY was not as engaged as we would have wanted, but there will be a cohort too. I just wanted to make sure that I plug that. If any of you work in mass timber or architects, there will be around too many grants to design with mass timber. But FDNY needs to be at the table in all of these conversations. I'm not the batteries person on my team, but it's incredibly important. And what we've learned, I think there are a few studies out, that even if you don't, at this point, have the ability or the permits to use a battery, a hybrid generator still reduces local particulate matter, still reduces CO2 emissions, still reduces that noise pollution, air pollution that we're really trying to get at from an environmental justice lens, while also building the electric market. It's not a perfect solution, it's definitely interim, but you're kind of stepwise kind of addressing some of the problems. It's not perfect. The second thing is, in conversations with the state, thinking about, what other state besides New York is ahead of the curve. It's probably California. California has an off-road vehicle incentive program called the California Core Program. New York State, I know, is considering something like that. So this would be a nice sort of program. I would keep your eyes peeled. I anticipate that will start this year. I hope that it would apply to something like a new loader like that. I'm fairly hopeful about that. So.
There's a new salt technology for batteries that is our next step to dance with FDNY, because their issue is fire, and lithium fire issues. This is salt-based sodium, no flood-proof, fire-proof. I'm excited because now you can inspect that. It's built in Asia, but hopefully we get American-made stuff to make it easy in the coming years.
Yeah, I would love to connect you with our batteries policy advisor. That would be really interesting.
Thanks.
Yes.
I have a question for Felix about the white paper and the reception of it amongst policymakers. And have you had any feedback from the state? Have they identified any immediately actionable aspects of it? Please share.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We actually started working on this white paper because of the demands we've had, policy and legislative members of both the Senate and the Assembly reach out and ask what should we do, how could policy look like. And so we've worked with them throughout the whole process, and we are now working with them during their bill drafting process. So I do know that there are currently 2 bills in the process, both in the Assembly and the Senate on the state level, that address 3 or 4 of our main concerns in the white paper. When Whether they will pass is a different question. But the fact that these bills will be introduced in a short amount of time is incredibly encouraging because it starts this conversation at a level where this conversation really needs to be happening. Also, right today, local Senator Kavanaugh reintroduced legislation into the Senate. So if you have any questions, it's probably worth knocking on his door and supporting this. The goal there is to sort of make the regrading of timber and other products easier so that you don't have to go through a long list of requirements before you can use salvage materials structurally. And so there's sort of the idea of auto-assigning certain values to salvage materials under specific conditions. That would incredibly help us to make these materials more accessible for a scaled market.
I think I saw a couple more up here. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is sort of for everyone, but maybe if Felix you want to kick it off. You mentioned time is very important, and so we're against the clock, right? And how do we kind of reconcile the slowness of our industry with the rate at which academia can freely explore, and then the policy that it takes to start implementing those things, but it still is like, there's a big kind of gap between those things. So I think this is right.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer to that. I mean, as I mentioned in the first couple of sentences, I think the best course of action is we all in every project do the maximum possible. I think that should be, as difficult as it is, but I think that should be our ambition as a industry. And I think that's the best way we maybe have to sort of reach these goals as quick as possible, because every project pushes the envelope a little bit, and the further we push, the quicker conditions change, and then policy and code and will fall in line. Of course, the sooner we can get policies to change the framework, change the conditions that we're operating in, the better. I think that is the key issue. Yeah, the quicker we can change the framework and require certain things, right? Because the moment they are required, you don't have to have this conversation with your client about, is this a good thing or not, and do we need to do this, and do we actually have the funding? If it's required, you gotta do it. So I think there's a role that policy has to play in the speed of this transition.
I can speak to policy, please. I think I mentioned it in my presentation. We are absolutely fielding fire, but that's because we set in place time-bound requirements for ourselves. Like the fact that in 2025 we need to establish these standards means that in 2025 the Department of Buildings, HPD, the FDNY, they need to come to the table with us. The city has already committed to this. So I guess similarly in your work, if you first start with commitments, if you have a firm that has a set of organizing principles, then you can then work towards requirements, I would say. It can seem very daunting. I'm definitely a climate optimist. I do think that we are running short on time, but every step to Phil's points along the way is really important. I think there's a huge role for pilot projects in New York, if it wasn't clear from my presentation. Going beyond academia, if we can prove out that private sector projects in New York can really achieve circularity, can achieve net zero, can reduce embodied carbon significantly, we can make the case for requirements, which I think is the bottom line. And the last thing I'll say to the point of requirements, right? There's this kind of false dichotomy between, do we regulate materials or do we regulate projects, right? Is there a life cycle assessment goal that we should be heading towards, or should we be regulating the concrete industry or the steel industry? I think it's a false choice. I think we can do both. We should be doing both. It seems like on a material level, it's more tangible for people to understand, people who are not architects, but there's absolutely a component for life cycle assessment requirements in building codes, especially in progressive cities like New York. So I'm thinking about both of them. I'm thinking about political palatability. It seems like the material level approach makes more sense right now, but if the life cycle assessment ecosystem in New York really takes off, I think there's more of a case for the Department of Buildings to regulate them.
I think you all said it thing is the way that we evolve, like humans are so slow to change, but once it reaches like the optimal point, I feel like all just kind of break through. I just want to quote, I think her name was Katya Henson. She's an expert in Cradle and Cradle. She said something really resonated with me. She said there's a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. So efficiency is sum zero. The idea of let's just reduce, you know, it's so not exciting. Like as humans, it's just like we want to be innovative. So she said, to play with words a little bit, efficiency is like to make the product better, but effectiveness is to make a better product. So I feel like that resonated with me because it really touches on like how you think about the way you design. Like we haven't changed the way we design maybe in 50 years. And then I feel like a lot of problems that we're solving with our technology, MEP, whatever, structural, the problems that we're solving, you know, we're creating solutions for problems that we create ourselves. So like it feels a little bit about like Band-Aid. Okay, I have this problem, let me just slap that on. I go, let me come up with the technology. So there's a little bit of that too, is not to reinvent ourselves like altogether, like let's just throw everything away and start from scratch, but really think deeply about what are some of the things we kept doing and we're just not learning. So I agree, like the policy and then, but also as architecture and practitioners, like we need to keep kind of educate ourselves. Like I can say for myself, like 10 years ago, my understanding about sustainability, actually I didn't even know what sustainability was, is to now just kind of really get curious about, question the way, is this the right solution? Should we even have this product at all? Should we make a stand about certain things? Is this a system thinking, systematic thinking, or this is just kind of isolated thinking and not thinking holistically? And that includes like the way that we talk to our consultants, our clients, is that are we asking the right questions? Are we understanding the why and why not? So I feel like all of that will kind of contribute to the effectiveness and how we approach, how do we do it effectively? Because if it's not, you're not willing, like we have to drag everyone along the way, it's gonna take longer. So.
We have time for one quickie. John. Yeah. You already
Okay, sorry.
Green sweater.
Question for Felix for Ithaca's 2030 electrification goals. Is that the goal for them to have, for the city to have sufficient electrical capacity, or was it more extensive for the city to actually be majority electrified by 2030? And then which parts of that are they, as we're halfway through now, are they able to, which parts are they able to achieve and which parts are pushed down the line?
Yeah, good question. The short answer is it's both. Electrification doesn't make much sense if we then run the equipment with diesel-generated power or coal-fired power plants. So Ithaca is working very hard on solar and hydro-generated electricity to then run all the electrical equipment that is part of the city infrastructure. The achievable parts that the city is very good at right now is transportation. The whole bus system has been switched to electric and hydro. So there's major moves in cleaning up the infrastructure. The residential parts is critical because we have a lot of home ownership, but then there's a lot of rentals, and so the homeowners usually aren't living in these buildings, but they're somewhere else. The question, how do you convince someone to electrify, is a key component, and the city has been quite successful in setting up incentives, financial programs, to actually address these questions. And that's been the lag in the movement so far, but I see speeding up in this process now.
Well, thank you very much. Schuster, president of AIA Brooklyn as of January 1, for a quick chapter meeting or chapter business, and then I'll fill you in on some new things on our website. Some of you are interested in. Go ahead, Marshall.
Thank you, Eugene. Thanks, Felix, Sylvia, and Y as well. Fantastic presentation. Some of the questions about how we disseminate information like this, I think is critical. I grew up in Southern California, and the last week has been particularly harsh for me. I have 3 good friends who have lost their houses from Pacific Palisades and Tuna, Virginia. So it makes me think that perhaps we do another one of these panels on resiliency. Multiple people have come to me recently, knowing that I'm an architect, and asked me how do we build housing in California that can withstand these wildfires that are happening right now. This is heading our way as well. We've had wildfires in the Catskills.
Folks, if you have to leave, please do so quietly.
Yeah, so I'll be really quick here. My point is, I think we could do something like this in the next couple months. So if you have any ideas and you want to collaborate on this, come say hi to me. I'll give you my email address, and then we can put this together. We have one item of business that we need to take care of tonight. At our December meeting, we shared our budget, and I need to get a motion to approve that budget tonight. This is a formality. Can I have a motion to approve the budget from the December meeting? Thank you. So that's all for now. We have some great programming we're working on, and hope everybody gets. Second. Okay. Any objections? Great. Thank you. I forgot about that part. So yeah, we're working on some great programming coming up. James is going to tell you about some new things with the website, and please come say hi if you have time. We have lots of food and drinks here, and maybe you can put a couple beers in your pocket on your way out.
Yes, please take food if there's some left, beer, whatever. We don't really, there's no place to keep it after this event, so by all means, take some with you if you can use it at home. So I'm going to be super brief. How many of you saw an announcement in your inbox about some new features for the membership directory? Maybe 3 of you. Okay. So how many of you actually clicked the link and actually put in the special features? Maybe like 1. Okay. So we've created a new feature for the member directory. You all received an email. Sounds like Kelsey, I think we need to send it out again. But basically, it's the capability for the membership directory to also identify your specialties. That could be, I'm a 3D renderer, I'm a Revit specialist, I'm project management, construction associate, whatever your sort of professional specialty might be. This is an opportunity for you to link that to your name, not just for outsiders, but also within the profession, within the chapter, people who are looking to say, hey, I could use a 3D rendering. Oh, that's a way for us all to connect. Also, we have tuned up the membership features on the website. So there is a direct link to join AIA National, join AIA Brooklyn. But importantly, there's a new second piece of that allows you to join AIA Brooklyn if you are already a member of another chapter. Second membership, effectively. No need to transfer your membership or give up membership from wherever your main HQ is, but it's a discount rate because it's understood to be a second membership, and it gives you the opportunity to get all this stuff like this fabulous event tonight. And then there's also a new automated page for sponsors. So if you are working with a window vendor, a roofing manufacturer, plumbing contractor, anybody who might make a good sponsor for the chapter, they can simply go to the website. There is a link for sponsor, and they can sponsor AIA Brooklyn as easily as you could join the Museum of Modern. So that's basically it. I'm going to say thank you all for coming. stay tuned because February is also very action-packed. The Emerging Professionals Group, AIABK, is joining forces with Women in Architecture Group to launch another Ask Me Anything on February 13th. This one will be a CV and interview kind of tune-up, help you nail the next interview. On February 19th, we will be joining City Tech at City Tech, where they are going to be screening the Low Tech movie. And there will be a talk back after with the director and the architects. And otherwise, watch your inbox. We have the spaces for around 8:40, 8:45. So please stick around, have a beer, some cheese, cookies, and thanks for coming.